Chapter 16 of That Mainwaring Affair. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. That Mainwaring Affair by A. Maynard Barber. Chapter 16. Mutual Explanations. Thanking the captain for his courtesy, Miss Carleton returned to her accustomed seat on deck, and since one is never more alone than when surrounded by a crowd of utter strangers, she felt at liberty to pursue her own thoughts without interruption. She could scarcely credit what her own ears had heard or her eyes had seen. Harold Scott Mainwaring? What could it mean? Could it be possible that the secretary, having familiarized himself with the family history of the Mainwarings, was now masquerading under an assumed name for some object of his own? But she dismissed this idea at once. She had assured him at Fair Oaks that she believed him incapable of anything false or dishonorable, and she would abide by that belief until convinced otherwise. But if this were indeed his name, what had been his object in assuming the role of Scott, the secretary? Which was genuine and which assumed? Who could tell? As if in answer to her thoughts, she saw the subject of them approaching. He was alone, and looking in her direction, and on reading the recognition in her glance, his own face lighted with a smile that banished the last shade of resentment and suspicion from her mind, albeit there was a question in her eyes which prepared him in a measure for her first words. With a smile as bright as those with which she had been accustomed to greet him at Fair Oaks, she extended her hand, saying slowly, "Mr. Mainwaring, this is indeed a surprise." She watched him closely, but there was not the quiver of an eyelash, only a slow, inscrutable smile as he replied, "Miss Carleton, I will add to that, and say that this is the pleasantest surprise of my life." She blushed at the implied meaning of his words, and he added, "I have not seen you on deck until to-day." "Not last Friday evening?" she inquired archly. His smile deepened. "I did not know that it was you at that time until after I had started below. Did you recognize me?" "I thought I recognized your voice, and I have often wished to thank you for your kindness, but this is my first opportunity, as I have not been out since until to-day." "Please do not mention it. Had I dreamed who it was thus braving the storm, I would have offered my assistance earlier. I have not yet recovered from my surprise on discovering the identity of my fellow passenger that evening." "Indeed," laughed Miss Carleton, "my presence here is very easily explained. It is simply the result of one of Mrs. Mainwaring's numerous whims, as she suddenly decided upon an immediate return to England. I think, however, that the surprise was mutual." "Accordingly, I suppose that mutual explanations should follow," he answered lightly, then added more seriously, "Miss Carleton, I am aware that there is much in my conduct that must seem inexplicable to you. In a few weeks everything will have been made clear, in the natural course of events, but if you will be at all interested to hear, I would greatly prefer that you should have a perfect understanding of the situation before the facts become generally known." "I should greatly appreciate such a mark of confidence," she replied. "If agreeable to you, Miss Carleton, let us pass around to the other side. It is less crowded there. My friend and I have 2 chairs, and as he has gone to his stateroom to do some writing, we shall be in no danger of interruption." When comfortably seated, the young man said, "It is a strange story which I have to tell, but I will try not to tax your patience too severely. 1 week ago this afternoon, Miss Carleton, in passing through the hall at Fair Oaks, I accidentally overheard a portion of your conversation with Mr. Whitney, as you related to him the story of the unfortunate love and death of my father, Harold Scott Mainwaring." Miss Carleton started violently, but said nothing, and after a slight pause the speaker continued, "My earliest recollections are of a home in Australia with foster parents, whose name it is unnecessary to mention, but whose care and love for me seem, as I now look back, to have equalled that bestowed by natural parents upon their own child. Not until I had reached the age of 15 years did I ever hear of my own father. I then learned that he had given me at birth into the keeping of my foster parents, with instructions that, unless he himself should call for me, I was not even to know of his existence until within 5 or 6 years of my majority. I learned, further, that his action in thus placing me in the hands of others had been solely on account of deep trouble and sorrow, of which he wished me to know nothing until I had reached the years of manhood. When giving me into their keeping he had also given them a small packet, containing a sealed letter, which was to be read by me on my 21st birthday, if he had not himself claimed me before that time. I was told that, while I was too young to retain any remembrance of him, he frequently visited me, and manifested the greatest devotion to his child. But as I grew older he remained away, writing occasionally to my foster father. In the last letter received from him, when I was about 5 years of age, he stated that he was going to Africa to make a fortune for his son. Nothing further was heard from him until there came tidings of his death at sea, in the manner which you recently related. Of all this I, of course, knew nothing until 10 years later, but what was told me at that time made a deep impression upon me. Of my mother I could learn absolutely nothing, but for my father, of whom I had no personal knowledge, and concerning whom there seemed so much that was mysterious, I felt a love and reverence almost akin to adoration, and I longed for the day to come when I could read the letter he had left for me and learn the whole secret of that sad life. My 21st birthday arrived, and the mysterious little packet was placed in my hands. It contained a few valuable keepsakes and my father's letter, written out of the bitter anguish of a broken heart. He told the story of his disinheritance, with which you are familiar, but the loss of the property he cared little for in comparison with the loss of his father's love, but even that was as nothing to the sorrow which followed swiftly and which broke his heart. He stated that, because of this great sorrow, he had placed me in the hands of trusted friends, that I should be banished from the false-hearted woman who had borne me and who believed me dead, as it was his wish that neither of us should ever know of the existence of the other. Harold Mainwaring paused for a moment, and Miss Carleton, who had been listening with great interest, exclaimed, "And is it possible, Mr. Mainwaring, that in all these years you have had no knowledge concerning your mother?" "It is a fact, Miss Carleton, that I do not even know her name, or whether or not she is living. I only hope and pray that I may never knowingly meet her, for her heart and life must be, pardon the expression, as false and as black as hell itself." There was a look on his face which Miss Carleton had never seen. Gradually, however, his features softened, and he continued, "In accordance with my father's wish, expressed in the letter, that I should complete my studies in England, I sailed for that country within a few weeks of my 21st birthday, and while there I learned that part of my story which is of more especial interest to all parties concerned at the present time. I had been but a few months in England when I felt a great desire to visit incognito the old Mainwaring estate. Accordingly, under the name by which you have known me, I arrived at the estate, only to learn that the home of my father's boyhood, and of the Mainwarings for several generations, had passed into the hands of strangers. My grandfather had died within 2 years of my father's marriage, and the younger son had sold the estate and gone to America. Incidentally, I was directed to an old servant of my grandfather's, who yet remained on the place, and who could give me its whole history. That servant, Miss Carleton, was old James Wilson, the father of John Wilson, Ralph Mainwaring's present valet." "Ah!" ejaculated Miss Carleton, her face lighting with pleasure. "I have seen the trusty old fellow hundreds of times, you know. Indeed, he could give you the history of all the Mainwarings for the last 300 years." "He gave me one very important bit of history," Harold Mainwaring replied, with a smile. "He told me that old Ralph Mainwaring, after the departure of his son for Australia, failed rapidly. He was slowly but surely dying of a broken heart, and though he never mentioned the name of his elder son, it was evident that he regretted his own harshness and severity towards him. On the night before his death he suddenly gave orders for an attorney to be summoned, and was so insistent in his demand that when it was ascertained that his old solicitor, Alfred Barton, the father of the present firm of Barton & Barton, had been called out of the city, a young lawyer, Richard Hobson by name, who had formerly been an articled clerk in Barton's office, was called in his stead. A little before the hour of midnight, in the presence of his son, Hugh Mainwaring, Robert Hobson the attorney, and Alexander Macpherson, an old and trusted Scotch friend, Ralph Mainwaring caused to be drawn and executed a will, completely revoking and setting aside the process of law by which Harold Scott Mainwaring had been disinherited, and restoring to him his full rights as the elder son, Macpherson and the attorney signing the will as witnesses." Miss Carleton's eyes dilated, and her breath came and went swiftly, but she spoke no word save a single quick exclamation. James Wilson, the servant, was also present, but in an obscure corner, and his presence seems to have been unnoticed. The next morning at 5 o'clock Ralph Mainwaring passed away, happy in the thought that he had at last made reparation for his injustice to his elder son. Within 2 months the old Scotchman died, and Richard Hobson was then the sole surviving witness of the last will and testament of Ralph Maxwell Mainwaring. This was all the direct information I could obtain from Wilson,